Representative Wintrow, how are you?
Well, it's Senator Wintrow.
Senator Wintrow.
I know. It used to be representative some years ago. I started out in the House of Representatives, and I served there for 6 years, and now I've been in the Senate for 4 and up for re-election. So there we go.
Well, you are my senator, and I will tell you, as I was just saying, you have no worry with me ever running against you because I am never, ever, ever. You know what the problem with doing public office is? The burden you pick up, you have to take a position on things. And the problem with me is that I know both sides of everything. I'm like, oh, if I had to pick one, I'm too dumb to understand what the right thing to do is, right?
No.
Yes.
No, you're not too dumb. And here's the thing, you're right, is unfortunately the current climate expects you to take a stance, all the time a stance. But you know, what I really try to encourage people to think about is if they're electing somebody, think about the broader sense of the person. Are they a good decision maker? Are they a critical thinker? Are they creative? Can they think outside the box? I mean, think about that in your general interview, because when we get on the Senate floor and the issue comes and politics starts to, you know, chug and churn, it's really important that you can fall back on character, your sense of self, and what your constituents want to make the right decision, I think.
Okay. But if I may, the problem comes when you, like, I spoke with Greg Casey. I've done a series of Prop 1 interviews, 3 for, 3 against. Greg Casey was for it. Yeah. I also did a debate yesterday with Commissioner Beck and Hiram Erickson. Great conversation. But Greg Casey was articulating that he helped people, specifically, not Rush Limbaugh, the Newt Gingrich. They had kind of popularized the 60-second speeches on the Senate floor, right, House floor, right, back in the late 90s. Now, they really liked those back in the day. And what's interesting is I didn't know that about Greg, but I had actually read a book a couple years back talking about how that really started driving a wedge between politicians, because the speeches were written in such a way that they were not designed to actually communicate information or resolve problems. They were designed to throw grenades, as Greg put it, and like everybody would get upset. And it was like, yeah, these are very galvanizing. They're very, a lot of rhetoric of like, if we have the courage to stand up against what we know to be wrong and blah, blah, without actually taking a position or articulating the nuance. Now, again, I'm not like, awesome, good job, Greg. Yeah, like you did your job well. But he even said like, yeah, maybe we're part of the problem.
Yeah.
I don't know, right? Like this is just something that was curious to me, because here you have something in the late 90s where you're thinking, okay, we're going to do our job right and hammer with these talking points. And here we are like 26 years later, like, was that the beginning of the end? Was that it?
Well, you have to think about what, we're all social creatures and we operate in social systems, right? And so what are the rewards and punishments for operating in any system? So people are operating toward the rewards, that tiny soundbite, right? That bomb throw. And you're right. When I started in the House, I was first elected in 2014. And I remember my first time on the House floor debating some bills. And I actually thought it was about not putting sound bites, but trying to convince people to vote for something. And it was, I think the bill I was debating, it was about horse racing. And honestly, somebody came up to me afterward and said, you know what, I rarely change my mind listening to debate on the floor, but you changed my mind today. And I was like, wow, that is great. I don't see that happening as much anymore, honestly. And it is unfortunate because as you talk to folks, most folks will have their minds made up before they get there. I wish we could get back to, even in the committee room, really pulling through subjects and topics and getting to a good solution. But what I'm seeing happening more and more in committee rooms is we're cutting off testimony, unfortunately. We're not really thoroughly vetting things. We're passing bills because of maybe ideology or a stance instead of really what's good for Idaho. I'm seeing too many template bills coming in from national think tanks instead of addressing a problem that's actually happening in Idaho. And I think that's really unfortunate. And it's a waste of tax dollars, quite frankly.
Somebody was talking to me about MSNBC and Fox this morning. It was like, I turn them both on every morning. First thing I do, get my coffee, and I just kind of bounce back and forth. And, people triangulate and get their information. And I think there's plenty to be said for, it's like, look, it's reality. It's not reality. It's entertainment. It's not whatever. It doesn't matter. But the thing I told him, I was like, look, no matter what we say, we can all agree that what people are spending their time consuming, like Fox or MS or whatever, has very little to do with Idaho.
Right.
And that's the thing that gets me, that there's no source where somebody's like, hey, I turned on this thing to learn about or engage with, X issue. So the whole nature of like the national template wreaking havoc on our even capacity to have conversations in the state. It's really frustrating, which is like, listen, that has nothing to do with it. And there are plenty of people who've moved here, like myself, who bring their baggage from former states. But it's like, whoa. How much of that has to do with what's happening here, and how much was like I had a bad relationship, right? And like I'm taking it out on my current girlfriend instead of my ex-girlfriend. Like,
exactly.
Yeah. So how do we steer the conversation though?
Well, gosh, that's a good question. I'll just say my approach is I try to solve problems, and I love solving problems, which is why I probably have stayed in office for 10 years. So for me, when I look at doing legislation, I really want to know, is it something that's going on here in Idaho? And every bill that I've passed, which I have to say, I'm kind of proud of that as a Democrat in a Republican state, I've passed over 20 pieces of legislation. And I point that out to my constituents because when I say, hey, what does that tell you? They say, oh, you can work across the aisle. Exactly, because I'm working on problems that all people value and see as a problem. So the first set of bills I ever passed were about sexual assault survivors and domestic abuse. We transform how we do sexual assault kits in this state. This last bill I did was a problem came to me from a homeless shelter. So I think we have to get back to legislators looking at what is going on in Idaho. We have to resist the political pressure to bring template bills into the state just for ideology's sake. And honestly, some of it I think is out of fear. I was talking to some people when I was door knocking. I could just tell they were just so afraid that other parts of the country, like Idaho, was going to become them or wherever they left. And I was like, there's no way. I mean, look around. We are not going to become another state that you're afraid of. And so I really try to talk to people about what is driving this fear. And most times it's fear of the other.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, I don't know who you've talked to. I'm not going to say they didn't. It's like whatever their experience with, maybe it's the fear of the other. But I have been telling a couple people this recently, that to conceptualize what people go through to move to a state, like for instance, when I moved here, I had lived in the same 5-mile radius my entire life. And I moved here having been here for 48 hours because I flew here literally just to buy a house. And then I flew home 6 weeks later. I pack up my family. My wife nor my 3 kids had ever stepped foot in Idaho before. And we pulled in and like, we're going to school here. This is our new home, right? To get somebody to do that, to leave family, to leave businesses, to leave everything they've ever known and move them somewhere else, you have to have that person at a level of, you're at like a 12, right? Like you skip the 1 to 10. You're boom, we have to get out. It's very hard to converse with those people like I was and say, hey, Matt, maybe we're not going to become California, right? Maybe we're not going to become, and I would be like, yeah, that's what you think, right? When I first moved here, of course, it's like, oh, we have to do anything. But it's very hard to explain or get in that headspace with that person who did take these grand steps and is horrified of the idea that these things are coming. And by the way, most of those people are still consuming the same news sources that they were consuming in California. So although these problems aren't finding representation in this immediate area, right, they're still consuming news sources and being told by people, it's like, oh, we have, this crazy illegal immigrant infiltration in Idaho. Meanwhile, Sheriff Clifford of Ada County saying we have fewer people running through our jail systems that are illegal immigrants. Yeah. And, there's no recorded mass transportation of illegal immigrants into Ada County, yet everybody's repeating these things. So you move out, you don't change where you're getting your information. And then there are people that continue to chant, hey, look, these are the national problems are these problems. And they're at the doorstep. So
I think what you're describing is maybe even your motivation to move here is very different as you were speaking than my motivation to move across the country every time I did. So I'm from Ohio. I went to college there. I did my master's in Georgia. I worked at Eastern Michigan, Michigan State, Portland State, Boise State. So I moved because I was following employment and, excited being a young person to explore new places, right? So what you're describing is that people are moving to Idaho for a specific reason, not just a job or a chance to explore, but I got to get out. And I don't know how you get over that mindset other than what you're doing. You're trying to put out conversations with normal, rational, reasonable people and trying to, I think, go against some of the propaganda that's just spewing. So let's talk about common sense, ordinary, everyday life here in Idaho. And I think you're doing that.
Well, I'm trying, but here's a question for you. You're a problem solver. You get your problems. I presume you aggregate problems from your surrounding areas. So people come to you, they're like, hey, I have this problem, I have this problem, I have this problem, or we have this problem, I identified this problem, boom, boom, boom. All fine. But what people are focused on, I think a lot of people are focused on problems that they're worried are going to make headway here, right? And you have the burden of having functional movement, right? You're like, okay, I hear that you're worried about this problem coming, and thank you for letting me know. But this lesser known problem that is not sexy and cool and not making national news, this is a really specific to Idaho problem. And we have to address this in a bipartisan way, like our water shortage. This is not a partisan issue, right? You have individuals in Eastern Idaho that would not have farms if we didn't have the Snake Plains Aquifer, if we weren't pumping out of the Snake Plains Aquifer, if we didn't have like all of the, if we didn't have cloud seeding accounts for 1.2 million acre feet of water per year, astronomical amount of water, right? And if we eliminate that, we absolutely do a massive blow to the Eastern farms, the Water Users Association. We, hamper our economy. We're going to increase food prices. We're going to, all of these different things, right?
Right.
That's not as sexy as like, can we deal with the books in the libraries and schools?
Exactly. I think you answered your own question.
No, but what I'm saying is, how do you articulate to people that as the aggregator of these things, how do you say, hey, I know that you're really worried about this, but this other thing that you don't really care about, this actually needs to take precedence.
Well, I think it's tough. And especially being in the minority. So in the Senate, there's 35 members, there's 7 Democrats.
Do you want a little bit more coffee?
Sure.
Okay.
Here, let me let's get that coffee first.
Bless America.
Nice.
Nice. For myself. I need to get a French press that's like twice as large.
I love it.
You know, the beautiful thing about the French press is it doubles as a coffee pot or a teapot.
Oh, is
so
that
you can,
right?
yeah, you can do loose leaf tea in it.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I do have something similar to take camping.
Yeah, I don't. The percolator?
No. I do love a percolator.
Are you insane?
I do love a percolator, but I have a press.
Trash. I would rather drink Folgers over the percolator.
My mom had this cute little metal percolator that she'd put on the edge of her burner when I was a kid.
Isn't that an Italian espresso?
Oh, I just love that.
Okay, but that's not.
And get little grounds in your coffee.
That's not the same thing. I haven't appreciated. The percolator is my understanding. A friend of mine was like, how the percolator got really famous? They made them out of glass and people could see the coffee bubbling up. It's like the coffee in blind taste test. Nobody liked the percolator coffee, but when in consumer preferences, they like watching it. It's the same thing between like Coke and Pepsi, like the blind taste challenge. Right. Pepsi always won, but you couldn't get it away from seeing the actual can.
Right. And you know what? It comes right back down to what we were talking about, irrationality. So you're asking me about how to problem solve in a sea of worry and fear while incorporating those worries and fears into legislation that are actually inhibiting people's ability to live their daily lives. So
that's a good way of saying what I said in like 5 minutes.
Yeah, it was great.
Way to distill it.
But in my position, I know there's certain things coming, and I've just got to try to do my best in putting out what I see and perceive as the facts and try to represent my district, as best I can. I am not going to be able to push back on some of the things you're talking about. I'll give you a good example. So a couple years ago when critical race theory was all the buzz.
And by the way, I would like to really make a clear point. I do not think, my kids go to public schools. I had a big problem with some of the books in public schools that I used to come from. And there are some books in these public schools, and I'd be happy to show anybody pictures of them if they like that. I was like, I do not like that book is in public schools. So I'm not saying people worried about books in public schools are wrong. I think that my school district has made great steps to address the concerns without the requirement of the state coming down. But I think having that dominate the legislative session, and it's like we spend all of this time on books. It's like, well, first off, communicate with your board members, right? Like the internet's way worse, right? We're worried about books, but we're passing out Chromebooks. It's fine. Anyway, so again, I do think there needs to be a very meeting of minds with, the actual parents in school districts and their board members and figuring out what books work for them.
Yeah.
But anyway, you were saying.
And those processes exist, right? And I think what you just described is a great process. If you're a parent and say, yeah, I'm really struggling with this book, can I come and talk to you about why? Absolutely. Come and talk about why. Let's sift through it.
Right.
But I don't think the state government has to use their heavy hand and say everything's going to be this way. Because again, when we govern in black and white, here's the highway, here's the right way and here's the highway, we're missing the complexity of life, which we see in another discussion point we're going to have about women's reproductive freedom, right? But I guess what I was saying is, using critical race as an example, I had a bill that year that I had been working on for a couple years to remove racist language in deeds and covenants, in our property deeds and covenants. And one of my constituents, once again, it was something brought to my attention, went to move into part of my district, the Mesa. And when he looked at his deed, it said only white people can live here, unless you're a maid or a servant. And he was like, oh my God, can I even live here? So he goes to the Fair Housing Council. They let him know, well, that was outlawed in federal law in 1968 in the Fair Housing Act. Of course, you can live there. But he's like, man, that really sends a chill up your spine when you move into a home. So he worked with some stakeholders. He came to me. We actually worked on this for 2 years to remove that language or allow property owners to do that. Because then if you move in, we document it appropriately. Okay. So that same year, one of my colleagues across the aisle introduced a bill to denounce critical race theory and the 1619 Project. And I said to him, because I really respected him, I said, what are you doing? He's like, well, I got to do it. My central committee's on my case, and I'm not going to win my election if I don't put that out there. Of course, it's not a problem, but I got to do it. I was like, okay, thanks for the softball. So we are debating it on the floor. I would say some racist things were coming out. I sat and listened, and I finally got up and I said, colleagues, I'm a little confused. We passed a bill 1 week ago today, unanimously in this body, to remove racist language from deeds and covenants. That is the perfect example of critical race theory, because we admitted racism was incorporated into law to deny people wealth based on their race. That's what we're talking about.
Okay.
And so,
understood.
So the example is, people aren't even understanding what they're talking about because somebody decided that this was the most, this is the best, most shiny object to get people's attention and to create division. But when I explained it, you could see people like, oh, they knew it, but they still did it for a different reason. And I'll never forget that day on the floor. I'll never forget it, because you could see in their eyes, they realize what they're doing.
What year was this?
That would have been not last year, the year before, probably. It was the year all the critical race theory comes out after George Floyd was murdered. I mean, it would probably have been 2021 or 22.
Yeah, 2020, fall of 2020 was that. And then, 2021.
It was probably 2022 because that person lost their election anyway, even though they were putting that kind of legislation out. So it was 2022.
Now, help me understand this. Critical race theory and systemic racism are two different things, right? And systemic racism obviously is distinct from... you can have like a racist person.
Critical race theory is really the kind of the academic term of how do we explore how racism has been incorporated into law. That's really what it's about. So being critical of how race has been incorporated into law. So when we look at the history of housing in our country, history of redlining, there were federal guidelines and laws creating housing and separating people based on race. The financial industry actually were giving loans out based on race. They were segregating people. And how do we pass wealth in this country? Through property, real estate. And so there's a whole group of people who couldn't enjoy the same kind of growth in wealth as white folks who were favored by policy, by law, just like that language in the deed and covenant, where they would not allow anyone who wasn't white to live there. And those are nice houses. They're worth a lot of money, right? So that critical race theory is the frame to look into how we've incorporated racism into law, right? School segregation. et cetera. Right? Does that make sense?
Makes more sense. And so this gentleman was bringing a bill forward to say, hey, we
hate it. We denounce critical race theory. And I think because it was just a dog whistle term to be used as if, it was liberal and it was attacking liberals, something, think about that. It wasn't really anything legitimate. And they were saying there was critical race theory in schools and teaching white kids to hate each other. I just didn't understand it. But I think that came out of a national dog whistle after George Floyd was murdered.
So I think what you're saying then is, and again, I just want to be clear. You're saying, hey, look, we have this perfect example of an individual who is, let's say, not white. I don't know what he was. Doesn't matter. But he goes to buy a house, and in the deed of the house, it's like, you can't live here unless you're white.
Yeah, it says so right there in the deed.
Right. And that's a very clear example of how somehow racism had infiltrated that deed, which was representative of a function of the legal system.
Right.
And then a representative comes to the floor saying, hey, we want to put this bill forward saying we denounce CRT, which you're saying is the frame by which we view how racism, like this deed, has infiltrated law. Correct. In some aspects of our history and our culture. And in some cases, like this deed, may still actually exist.
And they thought it was atrocious. Like when I showed the paperwork to my colleagues, their eyes got as big as dinner plates. Like, oh my God, that should be illegal. Well, thank God it is, but here's what we're doing. So gotcha. You explained it way better than I did, vice versa, tit for tat there. But here we were looking at a resolution to denounce the very thing we voted in agreement on, right? So that's what I was trying to help the people that day understand. Like, I'm really confused. We are denouncing the very framework by which we use to actually remove racist language from a deed and covenant, acknowledging that racism was incorporated into law to deny wealth for people who are not white. I mean, there's no getting past that.
I think one thing that even hearing you talk about this, my cackles go up. And like, I'm a minority, right? I have 2 African-American adopted brothers, right? Like it's offensive to hear that, right? And what you're describing, it's like, God, I can't believe that would exist. The other problem I have is my past life in my former state, seeing exactly what the people that were anxious about this talk about, right? So where you had this criticism of Caucasian individuals, like openly criticized, like this extreme, there's several friends in and out of education or the professional world, individuals that were in jobs where they had to hire a new, C-suite individual, and the CEO literally in a broad conference with the entire company apologizes for hiring a white guy. And he's like, we really tried to find somebody else. I'm really sorry we had to hire this guy. He just, and my friend who's a Caucasian male is like, what in the actual hell is happening here? Like, did he just apologize for hiring Frank? Like, Frank does a good job. Anyway, so it's that, but then also marrying that to, hey, this individual who lives 10 miles away had a deed to the house he purchased saying he couldn't live there unless he was white. Like, it's reconciling these two things where both exist. You could have a bastardization of racism in places like California where they go after 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds and browbeat them for their skin color, and actual racism in law in aspects of, say, property law, where it's like you can have a deed that says you're restricted based on your skin color. Like, these two things can coexist, right? Like, how do we help untangle that mess?
Yeah. Well, wow, gosh, our conversation went someplace I never thought it was going to go today, but that's good. So here's what I think. This is a hard topic to discuss, but I think what's happening.
Could I tell you something real fast?
Yes.
When you said something to a racist language, this is literally where my head went. I thought you were going to tell me that you guys worked to eliminate the term master bedroom because, like, master implies slave. I was like, if she tells me this, my head's gonna explode. And like, no. I'm pleased and horrified at the same time because it's like there was almost this aspect of we were so intensely searching for racist people in California. Not we, but people were. They're like, it said master bedroom. It said this. Like, you can't drink black coffee. You have to drink unmodified coffee. It's like, because it's black. They're like, you can't say, like there's this insanity that I carry with me and this anxiety around that insanity. But what you're portraying is not that. It's really confronting. This says you can't live here unless you're white. Like, that's a different thing.
Yeah. Here's what I think is happening is, age is a nice thing because it's a gift of looking at progress and back in my lifetime, right? So as I think about social trends, growing up in the 1970s, watching Jimmy Carter being elected, then unelected. I mean, when you think about progress over decades and even centuries, I think what our country is trying to reconcile and never has is our history of racism, right? And we can't deny that. It doesn't. I'm not saying George Washington was a bad person or Thomas Jefferson was a bad person, but slavery existed. And if you look at the laws that were written over time in the past several centuries, they're pretty blatantly ugly, right? We can look at them and admit it. That just doesn't go away. That residue is here. And I just don't think the United States has ever really reckoned with that. Now, I think what maybe is happening, what I'm hearing you describe is I'm not familiar with, but when we look at that history, we look at systems that we're currently operating in, it's probably better to identify what the system is doing versus an individual, because we all participate. It's not necessarily if, it's how, according to those systems. And maybe what's happening is, like, I remember having a conversation with my brother after George Floyd was murdered. When that hit, I think that's a huge turning point in our history right now, where we're in this kind of backlash to social progress, because I think when he was murdered and that was publicized, everybody said that's wrong. 20 million or so white people take to the streets and admit, yeah, maybe racism is incorporated into law. Maybe we better do some things. And then we started to see some institutions starting to address it. And even small ways, like, hey, NASCAR says no more rebel flags in the infield, and the NFL says no more of that. And people start saying, hey, we better start doing something because this is getting out of hand. And so you see, and if you go back and listen to all the news stories and so forth, you see progress happening and people acknowledging, yeah, maybe racism, and white folks are like, yeah, maybe it does exist in law. Then we see a backlash, not uncommon in social justice movements, not uncommon. We saw it in the 60s and 70s and in the 80s. And that progress moved, and we saw then right after that summer, I think it was Donald Trump eliminates diversity training in all federal programs. We start to see a backlash against all the monuments coming down. We see a think tank nationally organized to gin up the critical race theory. And that backlash, we're still in it, right? So I think what you're discussing is, like my brother said, I don't want that day. I remember talking to him after George Floyd was murdered. He goes, I don't want to feel guilty about being white. And that struck me. I was like, no one's telling you you should feel guilty. Guilt doesn't do anything. And what I tried to help him understand that day was, help me understand a time when race ever worked against you as a white man. I'm not saying you have privilege or social advantage, but has your race ever worked against you? And he's like, well, I don't think so. Okay. And so I think that's what we're talking about, is when we think about a history of racism, our country has had a significant series of laws and practices that have prohibited people from advancing because of their race. We have not acknowledged it. We won't be honest about it. We just want to feel guilty about it. We don't want to feel guilty. But if we could just get over that and just examine that, and then think about how we are impacted by that bias, we're not bad people. But we have to be able to acknowledge it exists, and then how do we confront it? Now, when people are disadvantaged and they finally start having a voice, they might go a little overboard, like you're saying, like, okay, no black coffee, no this. And I think that's the tension that we're seeing now, is when people have been so pushed down or felt left out, then they finally have a voice and they're coming forward, being themselves. And I think that has created then too a backlash against that. So, that's all very convoluted. So I don't think you should put that on your podcast.
Oh my gosh.
It's very convoluted.
You know what? I actually don't think it's that convoluted. Here, if I may, I could tell you many times when people that I'm close with have been disadvantaged by being fairer skin, specifically because they're fairer skin, because they're Caucasian. I could articulate many instances where people recognized that they were passed up for promotions, they were not hired for jobs, they were not blah, 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 based on skin color or gender. So I don't think it's the kind of thing where, because one person can't necessarily articulate it in the moment, that is conclusively like, okay, so this is a shut and closed case. I also, let me be very clear, I'm not 100% familiar with the laws in play that promoted George Floyd's death. Okay. I am loosely aware of a police officer who acted inappropriately that led to somebody's death. Right. And you want to call it murder, you want to call it whatever it is, totally fine. But I do not see the law in place saying this person is allowed to kill this other person and it's totally fine.
Right. The law, you're right. I think it would have been illegal. It was illegal and he was put in jail. Right.
So when you say 20 million white people come out and they come out and say, yeah, maybe racism is in our law. Yeah. I do not understand how those two events are related, because it seems that, as you just articulated, justice was served and that there was not a law defending a Caucasian person. I can also tell you that from my experience professionally. So I was an SAT tutor from the week I graduate college all the way until the day I moved here. That's all I ever did. That's all I ever wanted to do. I love teaching, big fan, love math, love grammar, love yelling at 16-year-olds. And the SAT was eliminated in California from public universities. That's the California State University system and the University of California system. So the school I went to, UC Berkeley, no longer even would consider the SAT because Caucasian people on average score higher than, say, Hispanic people like myself. Nobody cares about the fact that Asian Americans score higher than everybody, and neglecting the fact that, say, hey, Caucasians actually have a higher GPA on average than Hispanic Americans. But because there is a discrepancy between these two groups, we eliminate it completely. So those are problems that exist.
Well, let me ask you a question there. So maybe we should examine why the SAT was used in the first place and what it's measuring.
Sure. Could we start with the engineering certification degree and the doctor's board tests and all of these other standardized tests that obviously we use every single day to articulate competence and capacity? Because we use standardized tests. Yes, everybody picks on the SAT. Nobody has a problem with the bridge builder having to take the bridge builder test.
Yeah, well, you got to make sure you know the math, right?
Right.
I think what my question back to you is when you're talking about that, I'm thinking not how to refute you. I'm like, oh, I wonder what created that SAT in the first place. My other thought was, I wonder why they're, taking it away. What discrepancy exists and why? What are they trying to solve, right? And probably trying to solve the fact that if that's the only measurement or the measurement, they might be intentionally or unintentionally excluding a certain group of people. And then I'm going to ask myself, is that group of people have access to the same quality education that the majority of the white kids do? I don't know. I remember the first time I really was struck about the impacts of racism was when I went to Chicago in the early 90s with my mentor. And he said, hey, I want to go introduce you to my mother. We were there on a conference. We go to the South Side on the L. I get to the neighborhood, the whole half day, I'm the only white person I see. I said, I'd love to see your school. He shows me the school where he went to grade school. It was awful. And it dawned on me at that point, as a white kid, surrounded by white kids my whole life in middle America, seeing that, it really, I understood the issue of property tax and property value and how that goes into schools and creates discrepancies for people. And that he actually succeeded, not because of the system, but in spite of it. And he was my supervisor and had a degree in higher education. But when I looked at the school he came from, I was like, it's not because that's a great school. It's in spite of it. So there must have been some other things going on to make sure. And I wonder how many other kids didn't make it out. So I think, again, what I'm talking about is let's look bigger and broader, not just about my own personal experience, but that was a teaching moment for me. And I really started to kind of think about what is life like outside my little world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I have a great appreciation for that. I think the problem is that you have, like, if we took the collection of issues that are tied in my head to things like, hey, if you take the SAT example, it's like, hey, you have Caucasian students scoring higher than, like me, Hispanic students, so we should eliminate that. Instead of saying, okay, why is that happening? Right. And instead of eliminating that, we also know that they have higher GPAs.
Well, what's the marriage to that test? Like, why is that so important to everybody? Like, who cares if the SAT is used or not?
Well, I think it's the number one. No, I don't think. It is the number one predictive metric for first-year success in college. So if you're a school and you're a selective school and you want to have the greatest retention of students, you want the greatest predictive capacity to say, okay, this student will likely still be left standing at the end of this time. So that's it.
I'm not sure of that. And let me share a little bit. I worked in higher education my whole life.
Sure.
And I would see all kinds of students. And the really interesting group was first generation, because I was a first gen student. It's a miracle I made it to college. My parents never went to college. They didn't know anything about it. Right. I mean, they didn't even go to my orientation with me. I mean, it is a miracle I got through. Mostly because mentors and people looking out for me, right? But the thing I learned working in college and university is those first generation students, they don't have a clue. I got like work study. I didn't know what it was. I was too afraid to go get it. So when you think about first generation students, you got to think about too, what's a cross-section, intersection of race, class, all that.
Sure.
And honestly, what I see as a huge success point for students is the support that surrounds them once they get there. I worked in student affairs for a long time, and the more support programs we have for those students, they're going to make their way. Mentoring programs, faculty and residents, student mentoring programs, but things that really capture the social supports versus the cognitive supports.
Yeah, and again, I think that makes perfect sense. The UC system actually, in response to a lawsuit in 2019, did a study to figure out, like, okay, is the SAT even relevant? And again, if you just look at a 17-year-old in high school and you say, okay, I have an SAT score, I have a GPA, I have an essay, I have extra curriculum, all of these things. And if you only have that information about the student, what is the thing that would be the best predictive piece that says, okay, this person will likely be standing there? Now, obviously, you do the best you can once they get to your university. But out of all of those things, one, people can buy essays all day long, and it's even more exacerbated now with things like ChatGPT, right? Grade inflation is a massive problem that actually is exacerbated when you start dealing with private schools. Because, for instance, the school I went to was one of the worst in California. We had, of the highest socioeconomic group in the actual school, we had an 8% college readiness rating. So you, like, for instance, we didn't have a physics teacher for some time. We had a physics class, but the teacher left, and for about 3 years, some of my friends' younger siblings had gone through it. They were providing the kids with different substitutes every day. They'd give them the materials, they'd give them the lab, and they were teaching themselves the class. So that's the level of education being provided at that school. Mind you, the private school right next door, which was this private Catholic school, which my boys were going to go to if we were still living there, they had not just physics, but they have an honors physics program. So you didn't just get the 4.0 scale, you get the 5.0 scale. So the GPA disparity was even greater when you started dealing with private schools, which is totally fine. Like, I don't have a problem with any of this, right? Like, right. You're going to have parents that are willing to invest more in their children, capable of investing more in their children, and they do. And should be all of our rights. But if you look at all of these predictive pieces of information, the SAT remained the number one prediction of how competent people would do. Now, for instance, MIT, you could take somebody with a low SAT score and give them every social, benefit or support you could imagine at MIT. At the end of the day, the person will either be able to keep up with the cognitive capacity and pace of the university, or they will not. And the SAT helps at least to some degree figuring out, okay, like this person will be able to hit the scores or not. So anyway, the point is, why is it important? Because universities need to know who will most likely be the best fit here. And that's it.
And in society, when we know like liberal arts education, we value that because it's about being a well-rounded citizen, being able to critically think, be engaged, all that good stuff, right? Beyond that, I would also wonder what is the best use of those universities for society at large, right? So, are we capturing everyone that we could and should? Are there people who are financially disadvantaged that would really benefit? So to me, as I listened to you speak, I kept thinking of the larger kind of underlying question. Why is this? What is going on in our country where this is part of the conversation instead of, or in addition to, how do we capture the most people we can in higher education? And instead of it being so overly competitive, how do we cast a net to make sure we're being representative of a variety of folks who, maybe if they got the chance, they would better themselves, if that makes sense.
I've been struggling with higher education recently. It's a difficult thing for me to reconcile. And again, I went into Cal as a math major and then I switched to rhetoric. So like I have a deep love for communication and liberal arts, but the return, especially with the skyrocketing cost of it, the cost to the taxpayer that may or may not have ever gone, but just the person funding the state universities. I'm struggling with this. Like, what is it that is so imperative and important that, we keep shoving people into it? And again, not shoving, like we're not forcing anybody to go, but there are a lot of students that even I worked with in SAT prep. It's like, you're not going to be best served by college. Like, you don't even care.
Well, and I think that's a thing that I do see a lot of value in, really casting a wide net for students in high school to say, okay, what are your goals, aspirations, and so forth? Some people may fit in college. Some people don't want to fit in college. We have trades, we have certifications, we have all kinds of things.
Yeah, right.
I wish I would have been a carpenter, quite frankly. I love to build things. But
I built this studio.
I love
carpentry.
I love it.
I'm a big fan.
I love creativity. I love it.
Right.
So, I think, higher education is kind of skyrocketing. I think about the history of our own state, though. When I started at Boise State in the year 2000, we didn't even have tuition. We were just paying fees. So it was affordable. Students, very affordable.
Wait, back up.
Yeah.
In 2000,
Yep.
Boise State didn't even have tuition.
That's correct. The amount of money the state puts into higher education has decreased substantially year after year. I think we might be around 19% of the state's that the state is contributing now into higher education budgets. So you also have to think about if costs are skyrocketing, what amount a state budget is putting in to help those institutions as well. It's probably a much larger discussion than we have time today, but higher education has changed my life.
Oh yeah,
changed my life. I was born and raised in a very conservative Christian evangelical home, which I'm not denigrating.
Sure.
I love my mom. She was a Sunday school teacher. My dad, they're both passed away now. But I know when I went to college, like my whole life, like opened up. There were things that I believed that I was taught in that household that were not true when I got to college. And just the experience really opened my mind to a diverse world, I think. So I do value higher education.
Well, I struggle with it in that I really like the idea of having a cost-benefit analysis. And again, this is coming from somebody who studied liberal arts, and I believe that I was bettered for it. Now, mind you, when I started at Cal in 2000, I think it was $4,000 a year tuition. When I graduated in 2004, it was $8,000 a year. right? So doubled in a matter of 4 years. So a really, really big increase. And it has continued to go up. It is not, it hasn't doubled or hasn't grown that quickly. I think it's like 20 or 25,000 now. And UC Berkeley, some people would argue, is a good university to go to. So maybe the value is there for people. But there were problems along the way with the way they were spending money, like building a $500 million stadium that was then factored into the cost of tuition.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's like, wait a minute.
I was just thinking, like, how can we take that new football policy in the NCAA where they're paying all their players millions of dollars? You know, how can we get some of that football money back into the universities? But that's a whole nother topic. Don't go. Let's not go down that road.
I know. But what I would be curious to see, and again, we don't have this data in front of us, but what I would be curious to see is, okay, how much was the state paying in 2000? How much is the state paying now? Has that number, like if it was $100 million, has that number actually gone down to $90 million, or has that number stayed the same or increased, perhaps not keeping pace with inflation? But how has the cost of operating the higher education, like the Boise State campus, right?
You should have somebody on your podcast from some of the universities and talk about that. That would be a great topic.
My God, holler. If anybody BSU connection, like hit me up.
That'd be great.
You know, because again, it's why is it so expensive? You know, and I suspect part of it, I actually very much dislike the mechanisms for student loans. I suspect part of it is, okay, we now have the most secure debt in the history of the world. Like if I buy a house and I default, they take back my house. If I buy a car, I default, they take back the car. If I buy a stereo, they're going to take back, it's a nice enough stereo. But for you know, student debt, you cannot get out of it. It will follow you to your death.
Yeah.
And because of that, because it is so secure, people in my mind have found financial vehicles are like, okay, if we were only loaning $10,000 previously, this is the most secure stuff ever. We need to loan $100,000. Like I have $100 billion to loan out to people, and this is the most secure thing I've ever seen in my life. Give the money there, right? So as you have more people willing to invest in student debt because it's so secure, and you have universities are like, well, we could just chart, like we can, and obviously the 18-year-old is the one left holding the stick.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need to find this out. We need to solve this problem.
Listen, you're doing a great job on your podcast today.
Oh,
I feel
you.
I'm dropping the ball. I'm not answering the questions. I'm
we're
posting them
having a
to
discussion.
you. I love it.
I'm sorry. We've had a lot of coffee today. I'm just excited to be chatting with you. And again, different perspectives, right? Like, but this is the beautiful thing. Like, this is the whole point. We come together with different views and different lived experiences, and it's like, what's yours, right? Because there's no way you would know my perspective as it relates to CRT in the education world in my former state, which drives my anxiety. I would have never in a million years known that existing in Idaho right now, there are deeds that say, hey, you cannot live here unless you're white.
Yep.
That's insane.
Yeah, it is insane. But I think you're kind of, our conversation is striking at the heart. When I first got here, you said, yeah, you know, I moved here. I've been trying to do this podcast. I'm trying to, you know, have reasonable discussions with people with different backgrounds and so forth. And you said, you know, you like some people might have a little bit of fear coming on to the program. Yeah. You know,
I'm not out to get anyone.
Right. But I think as I go door to door in election season, I think fear is kind of a common thread in our state and our country today. People are afraid to have an open discussion and or admit that they could be wrong, right? So, you know, I'm part of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. It's I've been doing that for a while. I'm on advisory board now, but some years ago, I was a co-chair of a national network of legislators who was committed to, you know, leading with civility. And we were trained, and we'd go to different legislatures and really try to, you know, encourage folks to get to know each other, build relationships so we could have civil conversations and control the discourse instead of what's happening now. I don't know that we've been hugely successful, but again, when I do that work, you can see initial fear about being vulnerable and actually being honest about things because of the labels that people put on folks, and maybe a little bit afraid about that label instead of the person. And I see that when I go door to door. in my district is the North End, which is known to be pretty progressive. There are rainbow flags and everybody's welcome, all those signs. And then I went door knocking in Avamore, which is in the far side. And that's known to be more conservative. Different flags there, that don't tread on me and Trump.
Right.
And I went in there to knock recently. And I don't have an opponent this time. But I do think it's important to go door to door. It's important to get out there, talk to people, and hear what's on their minds. And I was walking down the street and a man accosted me and called me a communist. And I had 2 high school students with me and he was yelling at us. And I mean, it was mesmerizing. I couldn't stop listening, quite frankly.
Predominantly because he was yelling.
He was yelling, and I couldn't get a word in edgewise, which I wouldn't have anyway.
Yeah.
But it sounded like a newscast. It sounded like Fox News. Anyway, I thought, wow, if I could just get to some Republicans to demonstrate that I don't have 3 heads, I'm not crazy, I'm not, not the things that he said, I'm not a communist. And every once in a while I can. And people will listen and I'll show them the list of legislation I've accomplished. And they're like, oh, I agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that. Oh, okay. So just because I run as a Democrat doesn't meet your expectation of crazy. And look at all these things I've done. It de-escalates people and then we can have a conversation, which I think is nice. And I think that's what we're missing is I wish we could just have more conversations and without that label, all of us, right? I have fears too. Especially in this current climate. But it would be nice to get to a point where we could, take a deep breath and really think about what's better for the rest of our state instead of being caught up in just this firestorm of ideology and mess, quite frankly.
First off, I'm very sorry that happened to you. That sounds terrible.
Well,
if it happened to me, I would not have been a cool cucumber.
I'm a pretty patient person. And I think, too, I was a former women's center director. And so when you're in those kind of positions, you're used to leading from the bottom, leading through a relationship. You're used to being treated a certain way. So you develop a thick skin and patience. Not that it's right, but I think it benefits me in the system. But what I thought was fascinating, the 2 high school students were with me. And he's just yelling about different cities and I mean, I can't even describe what he was saying. And the students their eyes were as big as dinner plates. And we walked away and there was a woman watering our yard. And she kind of facetiously asked the kids, well, what'd you learn from that, kids? And they looked at her, didn't even blink and said, you know what? Here's what we learned. We don't like to be yelled at. We came out here to talk about issues and get to know people. This yelling has got to stop. I was like, it was so mature. And we went on to the next house and the woman didn't say anything more. But I thought that was really telling. They listened. They're like, I don't like to be yelled at. Why are we yelling? I want to talk about some issues. So I thought that was promising. So I didn't feel that bad when I left.
Well, I'm glad you had your team with you. Yeah, no, I've heard from a lot of people. Phil McGrain, actually, Secretary of State, had a fantastic point. He's like, we need to change the environment in which our elected representatives are operating, because by making it so painful and so anxiety provoking, and I talked to a former candidate about a year or 2 ago who was describing how his daughter was accosted, his 17-year-old. She's just walking down the street in Boise and some guy, came up to her and started screaming and yelling, saying all these horrible things. And she, cool as a cucumber, apparently was like, hey, I don't know where you're getting your information. It sounds like you're quite misinformed. I'd be happy to call my dad right now and set up an appointment so you could talk with him if you want.
Good for
and of
her.
course,
That's great.
Right. But the guy, her dad, had to make a decision between, do I continue running in this race and subjecting my poor 17-year-old daughter to these things, or do I just call it? And he ultimately called it. And it's that type of environment that will reduce the number of viable options for representation that we'll have. And it will only be the people that can tolerate insanity and can subject their family to insanity.
And that, I think that's so unfortunate. We're headed toward Idiocracy, that movie Idiocracy. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I've not had the pleasure.
You should see that movie. It's kind of, reminiscent of what we're experiencing. But I think that's really, it's so, well, I have 2 reactions when you're telling me that story. Number one, I want to stay in and fight, right? Like, hey, my state, my country, my community means more than, a strategy. of conflict and yelling for me to back down, because I do think there's a group of people using that as a strategy. They're using it. I mean, they're learning how to use conflict to basically push people out, good people out of office.
Right.
It's a strategy.
Right.
And so we have to find ways as a community to safeguard those positions so that strategy won't work. Because right now it is working. It's driving good people out of office, and I think that's terrible. And good people, normal everyday citizens, need to stand up and say that's not who we are, and that's not who we're gonna be, and back people off. Period.
I think the thing you said is really true, which is
I got one right. I got something true today.
I think it's really. I think this gentleman who came and accosted you, he's probably very worried about things, and even having this conversation, this is a very candid conversation.
Yeah.
And their anxiety flows with that. And I think that's what it comes down to. And I think that the predominant political strategy is to find that anxiety, capitalize on it, whip it up into like the craziest froth possible, and then shoot it at people. And I think that's unfortunate, because obviously you're not going to be able to resolve. Like I did I did this debate yesterday with Rod Beck and Hiram Erickson. And we were like laughing, having a good time, chatting about this. This was the craziest Monday of my life. Like, it's so great that they were willing to come and have a good faith conversation. And here we are, literally just talking to each other. Like, this is awesome. Why don't we do this more often, guys? And that's a beautiful thing. It's beautiful that we were able to do that. It was beautiful that they were willing to do that. And did we solve it? Yeah, probably not, because the bottom line is there are some irreconcilable problems from both sides, right? But we were able to get that information out. That flies in sharp contrast to the people on, say, like Nextdoor or Facebook saying, well, like, you're obviously just like a commie fascist. It's like, that's not helping.
Yeah, and I think too, when we're having these kind of conversations where we continue to have this cognitive discussion about trying to have issues and so forth, but it's really not that. It's about a deeper level of who we are as people, right? So there's a book I would advise everybody to read. It's called The Anatomy of Peace. It's by the Arbinger Institute. And it's a book I used with my students when I was at Boise State. And I said, hey, if you leave this summer, and I want you to read this book over the summer and come back to do your training. If you don't read it, you don't have a job. And I meant it, because the book is about treating people with dignity and respect. It's about seeing people as people, not as objects. So when you see people as an object in your way, as mattering or not mattering as much as you start to treat them poorly, right? And when you treat somebody as an object, it is much easier to commit an act of violence against an object than it is a person. And so I think, that book teaches me, again, we're in all this firestorm of ideology and so forth, but we have to take a breath and think about, we're all people, we're all human beings. We all have needs, wants, desires, hopes, dreams, and fears. Right? And if we could start at that point, all the better. And honestly, I bet if we put people in a room, like there's this organization that does this, they put people in a room of different political spectrums, and they start conversations with them, and it's obvious that people start liking each other, and then they realize they're from different political spectrums, and they start to treat each other with respect, right? So we have to stop seeing the person as the label and get to, we're human beings. We all have hopes, needs, fears, desires, goals, all that, right? And how do we find that commonality? And if we don't do that, we're lost, quite frankly.
Representative Wintrow, I think we need to call it on that note. That was beautiful. We had a conversation that I was not anticipating in the least.
We didn't talk about legislation.
No.
We didn't talk about my neurocognitive bill, which is really exciting. If I could put a plug in for it, can I do that?
Yeah, hit it.
Just really quick. So, there's a new law in effect to help people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And I mention that because when I was out door knocking just recently in Avamore, the first 3 houses I came to, the people that answered the door were caregivers of folks with a related dementia. So this is something that's affecting us. Our community is aging.
Right.
And so what happened was 2 summers ago, I get a call from the homeless shelter. There was somebody there with a neurocognitive disorder, Huntington's. Danger to self. Police arrive. They say, oh my gosh, you said she has Huntington's. We can't really do anything but take her to jail. She's throwing hot coffee pots at people. She's dangerous. Can't do anything unless you want me to take her to jail. I get the call, put a bunch of people together. We cobble together intervention, get her in front of a doctor. Doctor figures out, hey, her medications are off and there's some other physical ailments that are causing her neurocognitive disorder to escalate into crisis. So we got her help, and for the next year and a half, I worked with stakeholders, Sheriff Clifford's group, physicians, agencies on aging, you name it, in the room to try to figure out how to deal with this. So we did create a protective placement. So if somebody is in danger to self or others and they have a neurocognitive, you can take that person to the hospital for a 24-hour hold with the purpose of seeing a medical doctor to see if there's an underlying medical condition that's undetected that's escalating them, like urinary tract infection, very common to escalate people into crisis. So that law just went into effect. We've been doing trainings all over the state. We're trying to help police and others understand how to use it. And again, it's probably going to affect just a small group of people, but it's those people that we want to get out of the hospital and back in their home as quickly as possible and identify if that medical condition is escalating them. So I'm really proud of that. And it's got like 20 co-sponsor, which means it's a bipartisan bill, right? So people of differing political ilks can work together for the betterment of our citizens and solve problems. So that's a good place to end.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you for what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Thank you for taking the hit and representing the Democrats in the state of Idaho.
Well, next time we'll talk more issues.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure where we went on this, but it was good.
It was great. It was great. And listen, you can't solve everything in the first conversation. You just met me. Now you know I'm not entirely a crazy person. Not that I'm not at all, but not entirely. Thank you for what you're doing. Thanks for being my rep. And we'll see you on the next one.
Yes.